uncovering the true killer in a small town. The night was heavy with silence. A faint fog rolled across the streets, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the soft shuffle of footsteps on the damp pavement. Lena tightened her grip on the flashlight. She wasn't sure why she was walking down this road, but something in the air felt wrong. Her breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the cold air. The town was deserted. The houses on either side of the road stood like hollow-eyed sentinels. She heard a distant rustle. A twig snapped, sharp in the quiet. She stopped. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The flashlight flickered. She cursed under her breath. No time to stop now. The night was too thick, too quiet. Lena quickened her pace. Her mind raced, replaying the rumors, the whispers that had filled the town for weeks. People had disappeared, one by one. No one knew how or why. Some said it was the killer, but who was he? The old stories spoke of something dark, something buried, but no one knew for sure. A soft breath of wind blew past her, sending a chill down her spine. She turned the corner sharply, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, catching something. A figure just ahead, a shadow against the mist. Lena froze, her pulse hammered in her throat. The figure didn't move. She took a step closer, her eyes squinting in the dark. There, in the dim light, the figure seemed to take shape. It was a man, but his face, it was twisted, contorted in a grotesque mask of pain and rage. Lena's breath caught. The flashlight slipped from her trembling hands. The figure stepped forward. One slow, deliberate motion. Lena took a step back, her feet tripping over something in the street. She fell hard to the ground, her hands scraping the rough pavement. She looked up. The figure was gone, but the air felt colder. He was still here, somewhere. A sound echoed in the distance. A low growl. Lena scrambled to her feet. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and then she saw it. A flash of movement. The figure again, closer this time, and then she heard the voice. It was a whisper, low and menacing. "You're too late." Lena's stomach dropped. Her mind raced. Too late for what? The answer came in a rush. A deep, guttural scream echoed through the streets. It wasn't human. Not anymore. She bolted. She ran faster than she ever had before. Her heart felt as though it would explode. The fog swallowed her footsteps, hiding the trail. But the screams followed, closer and closer. The town wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive with the sounds of something terrible. And she wasn't alone. The streets blurred past her. But Lena couldn't outrun the sound. It was getting louder, closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps, every step heavier than the last. She turned a corner. Her legs were on fire. But something was chasing her. She could feel it right behind her. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. Something foul. She didn't dare look back. Not yet. A sharp sound cut through the night. The scrape of something metal, dragging on concrete. She stumbled. Her foot caught on something. Her ankle twisted. Lena screamed, but quickly stifled it. She pushed herself up, ignoring the searing pain. The flashlight was still gone. Her eyes strained in the dark. There, movement again. A figure. But this time, it wasn't just one. Dozens. Shadows creeping from every corner, every house. The fog thickened. Lena could barely breathe. They were surrounding her. The whispers started again. Low, guttural murmurs in the dark. She looked to the nearest house. A familiar place. Her childhood home. The door was slightly ajar. The light was on inside. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward it. Her feet barely touched the ground as she moved. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. Lena gasped, her back pressed against the wooden surface. Her eyes darted around the room. The house was empty, except for him, the man. The one she had seen earlier, his face still twisted, eyes burning with a cold fire. He was standing by the window, staring out into the fog. His body was still, like a statue. Lena opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come here." His voice was low, barely a whisper. Lena took a step back. The man's lips curled into a slow, cruel smile. She felt the room grow colder. The shadows seemed to deepen, closing in around her. The man's eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Lena's breath hitched. Something was wrong. Too wrong. She knew she wasn't alone in the house. Something else was in there with them. Her pulse quickened as the floor beneath her creaked. She turned toward the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. And then she saw it. A shape, a figure, lurking, hidden in the darkness. The figure in the corner shifted. Slowly, Lena's heart raced. The air grew colder, more suffocating. The shadows seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The man by the window didn't move. He only watched. His smile widened. Lena's eyes flickered back to the shape. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its body was thin, almost skeletal. And its eyes, black, hollow, endless, pierced through the darkness. Lena could barely breathe. Her feet felt frozen to the floor. The figure moved again, creeping closer. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways no human body should. Lena took a step backward. Her pulse hammered in her throat. The man by the window chuckled, low and menacing. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" he said, his voice like ice. Lena's mind spun, trying to understand. The thing in the corner was no man. It wasn't human. The air felt thick with something ancient, something evil. She realized too late that this had all been set in motion long before tonight. This town, this place, had always been cursed. The people who had disappeared weren't victims. They were sacrifices. Sacrifices to whatever the thing in the corner was. The man smiled again. "You're not getting out of here." Lena's body was moving before her mind could catch up. She ran. But the door, the one she had slammed shut, was gone. There was no escape. The room was smaller now, closing in. Her breath came in desperate gasps, her hands trembling. The thing in the corner was closer, its presence suffocating, its gaze cold and unfeeling. Lena turned toward the man, pleading with her eyes. "Please, what is it? What is this?" His smile deepened. "This is where it ends for you." His words echoed in the stillness. And then, in the blink of an eye, the room was no longer the room she had known. The walls were moving, shifting, changing. The darkness swallowed her whole. Lena's mind spiraled, trying to grasp at anything familiar. But there was nothing left. The room was no longer a room. It was a maze of shadow and dread. Walls pulsed, thick and alive, like the beating heart of some ancient, forgotten creature. The floor beneath her feet was soft now, like wet earth. She tried to move, but it was as if the darkness itself was holding her in place. Her hands reached out, searching for something solid, something real. But all she touched was more shadow. A sound rippled through the air, a low, guttural hum that vibrated deep in her chest. Lena's throat tightened. The thing in the corner wasn't there anymore. It had moved. It was somewhere closer now in the dark. She could feel it. The air was thick, suffocating. And then came the whisper. It wasn't the man's voice this time. It was something deeper, older. "I've been waiting for you." Lena's stomach twisted into a tight knot. She didn't want to turn around, but she couldn't stop herself. Her eyes darted behind her. The thing was there, just behind her, its limbs twitching, eyes hollow and black. It was closer than before. Too close. The thing's mouth opened, its jaw stretching wide, too wide for any human being. and then it spoke. Your town, your people, they belong to me. Lena took a step back. Her pulse thundered in her ears. No, she couldn't let this happen. Not like this. But the shadows had already begun to move, creeping, twisting, turning the room into something that wasn't real. She could feel the ground giving way beneath her feet. The man by the window appeared again, his face now twisted in something dark and grotesque. He was no longer smiling. He was grinning, showing teeth like jagged stones. You were always meant to find this place, he said. You were always meant to join us. Lena could hear the sound of the thing's limbs skittering across the floor, growing closer. Her breath came faster, each inhale like sandpaper against her lungs. The walls started to close in. The shadows were no longer shadows. They were teeth. They were claws. They were alive, Lena screamed. But the sound was swallowed by the darkness. It didn't matter. The walls were closing in faster now, shrinking, tightening like the grip of something unseen. She stumbled, trying to move, but the ground seemed to slip beneath her feet. The thing's eyes gleamed, its hollow gaze never leaving her. It was too close. Too close. Lena's hands scrabbled at the floor, searching for something, anything to hold on to. She felt a cold, wet tendril brush her fingers. A low hiss echoed through the room. The air thickened, oppressive, suffocating her. She forced herself to look up. The thing's mouth opened wider, its jagged teeth catching the faint light in the room. Lena's breath caught in her throat, but then a sudden, sharp crack. The room stopped moving. For a brief moment, everything went still. The man by the window looked over his shoulder, his face a mask of surprise. Lena didn't waste the moment. She pushed herself up and ran. She didn't care where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. The ground beneath her was uneven, shifting, as if it were alive. But she kept running. Her heart thudded in her chest, blood rushing in her ears. She reached a door, old, wooden, half-rotted. Lena yanked it open without thinking. She stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. The fog was still there, thick as ever, but the town felt different now. Lena turned, breathing hard, and looked back. The house she had just escaped from was no longer there. In its place was a vast, empty field. The shadows stretched across it like broken fingers, reaching, searching. The thing was still out there. She could feel it. But for now, at least, she was free. For now. Lena started running again, her feet pounding against the earth. Her mind raced, but she couldn't stop. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew one thing. Whatever had been in that house, whatever had taken her town, it wasn't done. And neither was she. Lena's legs burned with every step. The fog clung to her like a shroud, wrapping her in its cold embrace. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale burning in her chest. The darkness felt alive, shifting around her, whispering in voices she couldn't understand. She didn't dare look back, not yet, but she could feel it. It was out there. The thing. The shadows. They weren't just behind her. They were in her mind now. Whispers clawed at her thoughts, scraping against the walls of her sanity. Run, they hissed. You can't outrun it forever. Lena stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself. She pushed forward. The town was gone. The streets. The houses. Everything had vanished. The field stretched on, endless. And yet, somewhere in the distance, a faint glow flickered. A light. A promise of something real. Lena gritted her teeth and kept moving. But the fog was thicker now, denser, clinging to her skin, to her hair. It felt as if the very air was closing in on her. The light was closer now. Her heart thudded in her chest. It had to be real. She couldn't keep running forever. She reached the glow, stumbling into the clearing. And there it was, a house, old, weathered, but standing solid against the encroaching darkness. The door was ajar. Lena's instinct screamed at her to turn away, but the house seemed like the only place left where she could be safe. She pushed the door open. It creaked loudly. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The walls were lined with cracked photographs, portraits of families she didn't recognize. The smell was heavy, musty, stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. But there's something else, a feeling, a presence. She stepped inside, her breath shallow. The door slammed shut behind her. The room grew colder. Lena turned quickly, her eyes scanning the dark corners. The house seemed empty, but then she heard it, a soft sound, a whisper, behind her. Her heart leaped. She spun around. A figure stood in the doorway. It was the man, the one from the town. His face was even more twisted now, a grotesque mockery of what it had once been. And behind him, more figures began to emerge from the shadows. Figures she hadn't seen before. Tall, thin. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Lena backed away, her hands trembling. They were surrounding her, slowly, methodically. "You think you can escape?" The man's voice echoed, a low, guttural laugh in his words. "You never leave." Lena's blood ran cold. The light she had thought would save her was the trap. She was never meant to get out. The house wasn't a refuge. It was a cage. Lena's breath hitched as the figures stepped closer, their movements eerily synchronized. Each step was deliberate, calculated. The man's twisted face contorted into a grotesque smile. "You belong here," he whispered, his voice a slithering hiss. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, too loud, too fast. She backed away, her feet scraping against the cold wooden floor. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, pulling at her, reaching for her skin. The walls were closing in again. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't breathe. There was no escape. Not anymore. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding her from all sides. Their eyes gleamed with a hunger that had no name. Lena turned toward the window. A sliver of moonlight cut through the fog outside. It seemed so far away, a flicker of hope. She moved toward it, her body moving almost on instinct. But as her hand reached for the frame, something grabbed her from behind. Cold hands, clawed hands. They dragged her back. The man was there again, standing in front of her, his eyes burning with malicious glee. "You can't leave," he said, his voice almost tender. "You never could." Lena struggled, her breath ragged, trying to break free. But the shadows were holding her, wrapping around her, tightening like chains. She fought, desperate, but they wouldn't let go. The thing in the corner, the monstrous form that had once been a man, stepped forward. Its limbs were too long, too thin. Its eyes were endless voids. "You are ours," it said, its voice an eerie whisper that seemed to echo in every corner of her mind. Lena's vision blurred. Her body trembled with fear, but her mind was on fire with defiance. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't be trapped here. Not like this. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows alive and hungry. Lena's thoughts raced, frantically searching for a way out. But there was no escape, except one. The house wasn't real. It was a prison, a trap. Her mind screamed. She pushed past the figures, through the darkness, the shadows clinging to her like wet cloth. The man reached for her, his fingers brushing her arm, but she broke free. She was out of control now, moving faster than she should have been able to. And then, just as the darkness swallowed her whole, something cracked. The light, it flickered, a violent flash of blinding white. Lena's breath caught. For a brief second, everything stopped. The shadows stopped moving. The figures stopped. The man's face froze. And in that moment, Lena saw the truth. The house wasn't just a prison. It was a mirror, a reflection of what the town had become. a twisted version of something that had never existed. Lena closed her eyes. She was already gone. The light flickered once more. And then everything went black. Lena's senses were drowned in an overwhelming silence, a void so deep she couldn't tell where her body ended and the darkness began. She felt weightless, cold, and then a sharp pull. Her eyes snapped open. She was no longer in the house, no longer in the fog. The world around her had changed. The air was heavy with a different kind of weight, one she couldn't describe. The ground beneath her was no longer soft, but solid, rough stone, jagged and ancient. Her feet sank into it, as if the earth itself was trying to claim her. She looked up. The sky above was a dull, sickly shade of green, a sickening, oppressive hue that seemed to stretch on forever. The land was barren, flat, nothing but cracked earth, stretching to the horizon. The town was gone, but the shadows weren't. They were everywhere now, but not like before. This was different. These shadows were moving. They weren't just reflections of something evil. They were the evil. They were alive, and they were watching her. Lena stood in the middle of this wasteland, her body trembling. The man, the figures, they were gone, but she could still feel them, feel their presence, their hunger. And then came the whispers, not in the air, but inside her head. Low, insistent. You thought you were free, they murmured, but you never left. Lena's stomach turned. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The world around her seemed to bend and twist. The ground cracked open, jagged fissures spreading like veins through the earth. From these cracks, dark shapes emerged, creatures of shadow, eyes gleaming with malice. They slithered toward her, silent, predatory. Lena stumbled back, her breath quickening, and then she saw it. The thing she had been dreading all along. It was standing just ahead, watching her. The figure, the thing from the house, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its body a distorted mess of angles and hunger. Its eyes burned into her soul, endless, bottomless. It took a step toward her, and then another, closer, closer still. Lena's body froze. She couldn't move. The whispers filled her ears, louder now, drowning out her thoughts. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us. It reached out, a long, skeletal hand stretching toward her, its fingers curling like claws. Lena's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight, but she couldn't. The shadows closed in around her, and then the world shattered. Everything collapsed into darkness. The whispers faded, and there was nothing left. The darkness swallowed her whole. Lena's body was weightless again, floating in nothingness. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. She could feel it. Something watching her, something ancient, its presence suffocating. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Her mind fought against the darkness, grasping at any thought, any memory, anything to hold on to. But the more she fought, the deeper she sank. A sudden flash of light, brief, blinding, split through the void. Lena gasped, her lungs burning with the air she didn't think she'd ever feel again. The light faded, but it left something behind. A shape, a figure. It stood alone in the distance, bathed in pale light. A silhouette, human. Lena didn't think, she just moved. She pushed herself toward it, clawing at the void, dragging herself through the suffocating emptiness. Her limbs ached, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach it. The figure didn't move, just stood there waiting. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she closed the distance. She could hear it now, a voice low and soft, but filled with power. You shouldn't have come back. The voice felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. It echoed in her mind, growing louder as she neared the figure. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, raw, choked. Where am I? What is this? The figure didn't answer. It only watched her, its eyes hidden in the shadow beneath its hood. Lena stopped a few feet away, her body trembling, unsure whether to take another step. "Please," she gasped. "Help me. I can't go back." The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing into the distance. Lena turned, her eyes following the direction of its finger. There was something there, just beyond the haze. A door. A thin, glowing line of light in the pitch-black space. It was real. A way out. Lena's pulse quickened. "Is that—" The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. Lena didn't think twice. She sprinted toward the door, her body desperate, willing to do anything to escape the crushing weight of the dark. But the moment her fingers brushed the light, it was gone. The door, the figure, the light, it all vanished, replaced by an endless, howling void. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Not the man, not the creatures. This one was different. It stood alone in the distance, bathed in pale light, a silhouette, human. Lena didn't think, she just moved. She pushed herself toward it, clawing at the void, dragging herself through the suffocating emptiness. Her limbs ached, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach it. The figure didn't move, just stood there waiting. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she closed the distance. She could hear it now, a voice low and soft, but filled with power. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. It echoed in her mind, growing louder as she neared the figure. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, raw, choked. "Where am I? What is this?" The figure didn't answer. It only watched her, its eyes hidden in the shadow beneath its hood. Lena stopped a few feet away, her body trembling, unsure whether to take another step. "Please," she gasped. "Help me. I can't go back." The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing into the distance. Lena turned, her eyes following the direction of its finger. There was something there, just beyond the haze. A door. A thin, glowing line of light in the pitch-black space. It was real. A way out. Lena's pulse quickened. "Is that—" The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. Lena didn't think twice. She sprinted toward the door, her body desperate, willing to do anything to escape the crushing weight of the dark. But the moment her fingers brushed the light, it was gone. The door, the figure, the light, it all vanished, replaced by an endless, howling void. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had come, her body was pulled back into the depths. The shadows surged around her, and the whispers returned, louder than before. "You were never meant to leave." Her eyes widened in terror as the ground beneath her gave way, and then she fell, faster, farther, into the dark. Forever the fall felt endless. Lena's body tumbled through the void, weightless, disoriented. The air rushed past her like 1,000 whispers, sharp and cold. Her mind was a blur, fragments of thoughts flashing through her like broken glass. She reached out instinctively, but there was nothing. No ground, no walls, just infinite darkness. The whispers became louder, closer. They filled her head, drowning out everything else. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You can't escape what's already inside." Her chest tightened, as if the very air around her was pressing down on her lungs. She tried to scream again, but her voice caught in her throat. The shadows were alive now, closing in around her like a living thing, suffocating her with their presence. Something sharp grazed her skin. A claw, a hand. She didn't know. Her body tensed, bracing for the next strike. And then, a sudden jolt. Her body slammed against something hard. The force knocked the air out of her lungs, but there was no time to recover. The shadows were crawling over her, tightening their grip. She could feel them, cold and sticky, wrapping around her limbs. Lena's eyes shot open, but she couldn't see. The darkness had completely consumed her, leaving only a faint, dim light flickering at the edges of her vision. "Lena," the voice. It was the same voice from before, the one she had heard in the light, in the distance. It called her name again, soft but commanding. "Lena, wake up." Her heart skipped a beat. "Wake up." She forced her eyes open. The dim light became brighter. It burned. Her vision slowly focused on the shape in front of her. The figure. It was standing there again, the same one from before. But this time its features were clearer. The hood was gone, and she could see its face. It was her face, twisted and contorted, but unmistakably hers. "No, no," Lena gasped, stumbling back. Her heart pounded in her chest. The figure, her twisted reflection, grinned. "You were always meant to be here." The darkness shifted. The shadows began to withdraw, but not in the way she had hoped. They were pulling back to reveal something else. A mirror. A massive, cracked mirror, standing in the middle of the void. And within it, she saw her own reflection again. But this time it was different. Her face was pale, lifeless. Her eyes empty, as if she had already been consumed. A scream tore from her throat as she realized the truth. She hadn't escaped. She had never left. Lena wasn't the one being hunted. She was the one who had always been trapped. And now, the door she had once hoped for was gone. There was nothing left but the mirror. And her reflection. Lena's hands trembled as she reached out toward the mirror. Her reflection, her hollow, lifeless self, stared back at her, its eyes voids of endless darkness. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, suffocating under the weight of her own fear. The reflection smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that didn't belong to her. Lena's pulse hammered in her ears, faster, faster, until it felt as though her heart would burst. She wanted to scream, to break away from the mirror, but her body was frozen, held captive by its own reflection. The whispers came again, louder this time, an insistent chorus that echoed from every corner of the void. "You belong here. This is where you've always been." Her fingers hovered just inches from the mirror's surface. The light surrounding it flickered like dying embers, casting long, twisting shadows. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking her every movement, but with a malevolent twist. Lena recoiled, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it reached through the mirror. A skeletal hand, black as night, reached toward her. Lena gasped, stumbling back, her feet slipping on the smooth surface beneath her. The air around her turned frigid, a biting cold that burned against her skin. The hand stretched closer. She tried to pull away, but it was too fast. The fingers brushed against her wrist, cold and unnatural, sending a shock of icy dread through her body. "You can't escape," the voice whispered in her ear. Too close. Lena tried to pull away, but the hand gripped her tightly, pulling her toward the mirror. Her feet slid helplessly beneath her, her body jerking forward, against her will. "No. Let go," she screamed. But the words were swallowed by the darkness. The mirror, her reflection, began to pulse with a sickly light. It was no longer just a reflection. It was alive. The dark hand tugged at her, dragging her toward the surface, where her own reflection now moved, alive and waiting. The edges of the mirror twisted and warped like liquid, pulling her in deeper, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace. Her breath came in panicked gasps, but it was harder to breathe with each passing second. The figure, her asterisk figure, grinned wider, its eyes gleaming with the same dark emptiness that had taken hold of the town. "You are us," it whispered, its voice now the only sound in the void. Lena's legs buckled beneath her as the mirror surface began to pull her in completely. Her body trembled uncontrollably as she fought to break free. But she couldn't. Her hands stretched toward the edges of the mirror, the cold surface digging into her skin as she struggled. She tried to scream again, but the sound was lost in the void. Her fingers slipped from the edges, and then, with one final, forceful tug, the darkness closed around her. The last thing Lena felt was the crushing cold. And then, nothing. Lena's world was plunged into cold, suffocating blackness. She couldn't feel her body anymore, couldn't move. Her mind was drifting, floating in a void where time didn't exist. Her thoughts came in fragmented pieces, like broken glass she couldn't put together. But then a flicker, a spark, a light. It was so small at first, just a faint glow on the edges of her awareness. Lena clung to it, grasping for anything that might pull her from this endless void. The light grew, expanding, and then, suddenly it wasn't a light at all. It was the mirror. She was inside it. Lena's eyes snapped open, but she wasn't in her body. She was floating inside the reflection. The cold, glassy surface stretched out before her, as if it were now the entire world. Her reflection was there too, standing before her, grinning. A twisted version of herself, its eyes black as night, gleaming with malice. "You belong here," the reflection said, its voice filling her head, louder than before. Lena's breath quickened, a sharp, guttural sob escaping her throat. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. The reflection took a step toward her, its smile growing wider, more sinister. The space around Lena began to shift, the walls of the mirror warping, twisting, like liquid glass. She could feel it, the darkness seeping in, crawling through the cracks, covering everything. "This is where you've always been," the reflection whispered again, its voice now 1,000 voices, each one colder than the last. "Asterisk, you never left. You were never meant to asterisk." Lena's chest tightened, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Her eyes were wide with terror as she watched the reflection, her own twisted self, step closer. Her body trembled, but it wasn't her body anymore. It was the reflection's. She wasn't standing, she was inside it. And the reflection's eyes locked onto hers, the void in its gaze, pulling her in, deeper. "This is your end," it said, its lips curling in a smile that didn't belong to anyone human. Lena could feel it, the weight of the mirror closing in on her, pulling her deeper, suffocating her with its cold, glassy grip. The shadows from the edges of the reflection reached out toward her, their long, skeletal fingers brushing her skin. And then everything went silent. Lena couldn't hear her own thoughts anymore. The darkness was complete. Her reflection was all that remained. Lena's mind was empty. Her body was numb. The reflection stood before her, a cold, silent presence that filled the space around her. She could feel it, though, something shifting in the air. A deep, unsettling tension. A presence that wasn't hers. Her own eyes stared back at her. But they were no longer her eyes. They were hollow, voids of black, endless. The air was thick with the weight of it, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. "You were always meant to be here," the reflection whispered again, its voice more fragmented, breaking into multiple tones. It was no longer just one voice. It was the voices of many, all layered over each other, chanting in unison. Lena tried to move, tried to speak, but nothing happened. Her body was a puppet, bound by invisible strings, unable to break free. The reflection stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "Asterisk, you are part of this place now. This is where you will stay, asterisk." It reached out, not with its hands, but with the shadows that clung to its form, reaching for Lena. Lena's skin crawled as the shadows crept over her, like ice-cold fingers wrapping around her limbs, her neck, her chest. The sensation was suffocating, choking, but the shadows didn't stop. They poured over her, as if they were consuming her whole, pulling her deeper into the reflection. The more they touched her, the more she felt herself fading, disappearing. A cold, sharp pain stabbed through her chest, pulling at her very soul. "You were never meant to leave," the reflection repeated, its voice now a guttural growl. The shadows enveloped her completely, drowning out everything else. Lena tried to scream, but the sound was trapped inside her, lost in the darkness that had become her reality. The reflection smiled wider, its features contorting as it mirrored Lena's every movement, only twisted, monstrous. And then it spoke one last time. "We are one now." The last thing Lena felt was the cold and the crushing weight of the void. And then she was gone, swallowed whole by the mirror. The void was vast, endless. Lena floated in the inky blackness, her body weightless, drifting with no sense of direction. The coldness that had once overwhelmed her had faded, replaced by an eerie calm, as though time itself had stopped. But something wasn't right. There was a sense of waiting, of watching. Lena's eyes snapped open, though she wasn't sure when they had closed. She felt the pull again, stronger this time, a force tugging at her, drawing her towards something she couldn't see but knew was there. A flicker of light broke the blackness, so faint, so small, that it seemed like a mirage. Lena reached for it, instinctively. Her hand moved through the air, but it was slow, like she was wading through thick water. The light grew, brightening and expanding as she moved closer. It felt warm, inviting. Escape. That single word echoed in her mind, whispered as if by someone else. The word filled her chest with hope, that strange, fragile thing. She moved faster, pushing herself toward the light, her limbs more responsive now, like the hold of the darkness was weakening. The coldness that had gripped her earlier had dissipated, and now only the warmth of the light surrounded her. The shadows, which had once clawed at her, had fallen away. The whispering voices were no longer in her mind. Lena's heart began to race. Could this be real? Was it possible? As the light grew larger, she saw it clearly now. There was a door, shimmering in the brilliance, outlined in gold. Its frame was tall, imposing, but inviting, like a path to something better. She reached for the handle. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cool metal. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena breathed a full breath. The air was clean, alive. This is it, she thought. This is the way out. She pulled the door open, and the light flooded her vision. A new world stretched out before her, lush and green, bathed in the soft glow of daylight. The air was fresh, the ground solid beneath her feet. It was a place untouched by shadows. Lena stepped through the door, the last remnants of the darkness fading as the door clicked shut behind her. She was free. At last, Lena stood in the quiet light, taking a deep breath. The world around her was still, but it was alive. The air smelled fresh, untouched by the suffocating weight of the darkness she had escaped. She could feel the warmth of the sun, gentle on her skin, and the earth beneath her feet felt solid, real. For a moment, she simply stood there, not sure if it was truly happening. Her heart, once heavy with fear, now beat with a tentative sense of relief. Was it over? She looked around, taking in the peaceful landscape that stretched before her. Rolling hills, green trees swaying in a soft breeze. There was no fog, no creeping shadows, just an open sky and a sense of quiet peace. Lena took another step forward, her feet grounding her deeper into the earth. With each step, she felt the weight lift. She turned, half expecting to see the dark door still behind her. But it wasn't there. The door had vanished. All that was left was the world before her. The place she had walked into was real, tangible. She felt alive again, her thoughts clearer. The oppressive, crushing force that had once hung over her, threatening to swallow her whole, was gone. The air around her hummed with possibility, with freedom. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker at the edge of her vision. The stillness around her began to warp. The light flickered, and with it a shadow crawled, just a tiny sliver, toward the edge of the peaceful world. Lena froze, a chill running down her spine. But the shadow didn't move any closer. It remained in the distance, barely visible. She swallowed hard, the lingering fear trying to creep back into her chest. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was free, and whatever came next, she was ready. For the first time in a long time, Lena smiled and walked forward, into the light,